Today's episode is the love of humanity, specifically Nietzsche's love of humanity. I want to talk about a little section from the Gay Science, specifically 377, which I think is really interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, Nietzsche gets like a little vicious. His little claws come out, right? And for good reason, because when people talk about the love of humanity, it can be kind of a red flag since such an egregiously pro-social belief there's an incentive to spread that kind of idea disingenuously, right? It's kind of like, everyone's a team player, everyone loves people, but then somehow when you get on the road, seems there aren't a lot of drivers that are people lovers. Not a lot of people fans out there on the streets, seems to me. And so in the section that I'm going to read, I'm actually just going to read a little snippet of it. I think that he tackles this idea head on. He basically insults it. And he also has an idea called humaneness, which is in contrast to this, I think, that I want to talk about later. But, it's hard enough for people to love their family, their spouse, themselves, let alone people everywhere. So, he just comes out here guns ablazing, right? So here's a snippet, right? So he says, the religion of pity to which one would like to convert us. Oh, we know the hysterical little males and females well enough who today need precisely this religion as a veil and makeup. We are no humanitarians. We should never dare to permit ourselves to speak of our love of humanity. Our kind is not actor enough for that, or not Saint-Simonist enough, not French enough. One really has to be afflicted with a Gallic excess of erotic irritability and enamored impatience to approach, in all honesty, the whole of humanity with one's lust. Right? And I think there's another little dig there that's developed more in the Antichrist, which is the kind of irritability and fragile sensitivity that leads to his reading of the Christian perspective, which is just like too sensitive for the world, kind of. And it's really interesting that he brings up Saint-Simon. There's also a little bit of irony there, but if you're not familiar with Henri de Saint-Simon, that is an utopian that is a utopian socialist, right? Henri de Saint-Simon. I'm just going to call him Saint Simon because I can't really be that pretentious and use French words, okay? But yeah, so utopian socialists, they were obviously derided by the scientific socialists. Actually, we're scientific. I think it's kind of strange that people talk about scientific socialism since, there isn't really much science going on in regular science, right? There's a lot of difficulty in finding out. Well, number one, there's finding data, and it's really hard to make sense of it. A lot of failure, a lot of wasted time. And that's with something that's, relatively hard science like biology, let alone sociology or politics. It's just a total mess. I mean, I guess the idea is that there's a scientific attitude towards it rather than just imagining things. But, Saint Simon or Saint Simon, he actually had this dream about connecting the whole world through canals, which, he never really got it off the ground, but one of his disciples actually influenced the building of the Suez Canal. So, say what you will about utopian socialists, but apparently they build pretty good canals. So anyway, he uses Saint Simon as this over effusive sensibility, right? But this guy, Saint Simon, he wasn't really a big bundle of joy, right? And he was betrayed by his business partner. He had a failed marriage. He was poor, had a lot of money troubles, had bad health, and he even tried to, blast his brain open with a bullet. Tried to shoot himself in the face, and didn't even succeed at that. Right? I've read in some places that the number of attempts, or like the number of bullets that he shot at his own head was 6. Shot himself 6 times. I don't really know if I believe that, but I do believe that he, put his eye out in doing that. And, like you can link his suicidal despair with the fact that, he had these really grand ambitions about how he wants to transform all of society into something more efficient, ironically, scientifically oriented, right? To use science and engineering to build a better world for everybody, right? Not have people wasting their time, right? Use their minds to their full potential, their full capability to build everything better, right? But no one cared. Most people didn't really pay attention to his ideas. Not really. He had some people reading his stuff, but obviously not enough, since he tried to kill himself. And a lot of the stuff that he put forward, like progress, equal rights, free society, Nietzsche, especially in that section that I quoted from 377, not really on board for some interesting reasons. But the idea that it's unhealthy to set up these really elaborate fantasies of a better world. This idea of setting up these fantasies is dangerous, and has been recognized as such for a very long time in philosophy. So in Phaedo, Socrates, brings this up about, visions of impossible worlds where everything's sunny. It's going to butt up against reality. And, it'll lead you to some kind of misanthropy or another, right? If you have all these high standards, you're just going to dislike everybody and notice that there's no sincerity anywhere, right? Because lying is so fundamental to being a functioning person in society, right? You have to constantly filter things out, calculate what to say, when to say it, how to say it, right? You have to be very careful with your words because they're powerful. And just because something pops in your mind doesn't mean it's correct, doesn't mean it's worth saying, right? So you have to be very dexterous with what you put forward, right? And people will use your honesty against you, that kind of stuff, right? So lying is really fundamental. Deception, right? There's actually some research I've seen that shows deception can be beneficial and pro-social in many circumstances, as everyone knows. And so, of course, Nietzsche talks about this in Ecce Homo, right? About, how the ideal world scrubs the actual world of its value, of its worth, right? Instead of appreciating what we have, what's there, you're, kind of dreaming about something better. But it's obviously not that simple. And I wouldn't say that this section about the love of humanity encompasses Nietzsche's entire views, right? It's just one perspective that he has, which I think tackles an important fact, right? About how phony it is to talk about your love of humanity. You're being an actor, you're pretending, right? And he's like, the people I want on my side, they're not really such big pretenders, right? They're more real, right? Although he also sees the value in pretending and being a poet and making stuff up, right? But, in that same section, he specifically talks about living apart from society to prevent what he calls the silent rage to which we know we should be condemned as eyewitnesses of politics that are desolating the German spirit by making it vain. So, he clearly has ambitions for the world, right? At least in this section. And that is going to cause a lot of frustration, which maybe in some cases is good, right? I mean, like I said, Saint Simon, he might have been depressed and suicidal, but he did live on through his disciples, kind of like Nietzsche did. Nietzsche didn't have such great success when he was alive, right? Which is another similarity with Nietzsche and Saint Simon, right? Like they both actually felt that splitting up the spirit and the flesh was a poison to civilization, and that the current world that we live in is the only one that matters, right? There's no afterlife, no ghosts or anything like that. And Saint Simon's disciple, Barthélemy Prosper Enfantin, I'm just going to call him Bart. So Bart, he started a commune in the 1830s, just as Nietzsche, Salome, and Ray, he once planned to do, didn't really work out. And what is it with young people starting communes? I've been there myself. I didn't actually start it, but there was that dream. And although, I wonder, like whenever people get rich, they don't often start communes, right? Because we thought, me and my group of friends, like if only we had the cash to like buy a house and start a commune, then we'd do it. But it's like the impression that comes to mind is when people have a lot of dough, they got a lot of wealth, they tend to move away from where other people are. They have their nice little spot. Maybe they're just like a little bit outside the city. Maybe they're inside the city, but it's just like keep people away, right? Maybe you do a little philanthropy here and there, right? But it's like, it's really hard to have a love of humanity, right? It's much more convenient to keep people at arm's length. Anyway, so they started this commune, Bart and some of his buddies, but didn't go so well for him. He actually got thrown in prison for offending public morality. Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche called himself an immoralist, but he was, by all accounts, impeccably mannered, which is what I love about him. He's clearly someone who's got the guts to experiment with ideas, but he realizes that behavior is important it's important to modulate behavior around other people. You can't be, screaming about the truth, to people. There's even this story about, these old women in Italy asking him, like, which of your books should we read? These are all these old pious women. He's like, Nietzsche's like, don't bother. This isn't for you, right? You've got like a nice normal life. What's the point in you questioning God at this stage in your life, right? It doesn't really matter. Whether that's true or the correct way, I don't know, but I like it. So Enfantin, or Bart, I was going to call him Bart. So he had this idea of a meritocratic society, which, has like a little bit of an Ubermensch flavor. And Saint Simon didn't care about the idling class. He didn't like them. Right? He wanted to privilege industry, science, and productivity above hereditary and military hierarchy, which is kind of anti-Nietzschean in some ways. And he even gave up his aristocratic title after seeing the lack of social privilege in the United States. And I mean, Nietzsche was a big fan of otium, right? About leisure of the aristocratic ruling class. And there's a section in Human All Too Human, section 284, where he says, leisure and idleness are a noble thing. But then he asks, hey, you don't think that by leisure and idling, I'm talking about you, do you, lazy bones? Right? And I mean, you can understand where he's coming from, right? Because when you talk about leisure, you could imagine someone like Charles Darwin revolutionizing science by going on his voyage. Or you could talk about somebody, playing Call of Duty and drinking Mountain Dew and getting high. Those are both leisure, but they're not really both noble, I would say. Obviously, Call of Duty is more noble. But so we have, this vision of a future based on industry and science, which is pretty compelling. It's kind of come true. I mean, what's happening here? I'm one of the people who's not exactly on the top of society. I mean, I'm getting there. Obviously, I have subscribers in double digits now, right? But but yeah, like I can get pretty much any book I want in a matter of seconds, add it to this vast library, which rivals that of any aristocrat in history. Don't really have as much time to read them, but we're getting there. So would I be suggesting, would I be going too far to suggest that Saint Simon's technocratic vision of the future is similar to Nietzsche's image of man as tied to a rope between beast and overman? Because, we're using technology to overcome our beastliness. Anyway, so the values of progress, equality of rights, and free society, they seem immediately palatable to most people, but that's in part because they're so, again, recognizably pro-social beliefs, right? It's about wrapping your whole arms around the world, right? So it's very harmless, right? You want to include everybody. But I think it's worth going into the history of the contempt of humanity, or at best indifference to the death of people, right? So if you look at the famous Trojan War, right? Normally we think about the abduction of Helen by Paris. But if you look at a lost part of the Greek epic cycle, the Cypria, you find a little bit of a different story. So in that story, and I'll quote, "There was a time when the countless tribes of men, though wide dispersed, oppressed the surface of the deep-bosomed earth. And Zeus saw it and had pity, and in his wise heart resolved to relieve the all-nurturing earth of men by causing the great struggle of the alien war, that the load of death might empty the world. And so the heroes were slain in Troy, and the plan of Zeus came to pass." Right? So it's not really such a romantic story. He's like, just too many people. Just let's get them to kill each other and clean things up a little bit, right? And this would have been the Cypria would have been the fruit of a long oral tradition, right? We can only imagine that the disgust with people ruining the earth would have been formulated a long time before it was written, sometime in the 7th century BC, at a time when Greece already had about 2 million people, right? So if they were getting a little bit, if their style was getting cramped at 2 million people, spread across a really large area, we can expect something similar a little earlier too. And indeed, if you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, written sometime between 1200 BC and 2100 BC, so, almost 4,000 years ago, or more even, the Epic of Gilgamesh was written at a time when city populations would have been, in the tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands. So that's, I live in Toronto, and that would be like a tiny town in like the exurbs, right? Or whatever is like past the greater Toronto area, right? Just like a tiny little town, right? And in Gilgamesh, there's this guy, or a god, I should say. Let's be serious here, okay? There's a god named Enlil, and he's fed up with the sheer number of noisy human beings, and he decides to flood the world so he can get a good night's sleep, right? See, I haven't gotten good sleep. That's why I'm slurring and stumbling over my words, right? If only I could get rid of these noisy human beings, right? And sleep is very important, even for a god, right? Gotta stop the noise. I personally use an air purifier, which I got, you know, running next to my head. And so if there's any noise, it cancels that out. But they didn't have air purifiers in 2100 BC, right? Even the gods didn't, you know, have access to that. So he decides to flood the world, right, to get a good night's sleep. And there's another god named Ea. Ea. And Ea, he's like, I think it's a she. She's like, well, I got to do something about this, right? And so she goes to a guy named Utnapishtim. And Ea goes to Utnapishtim. She's like, listen, things are gonna get a little bit dicey, mate. You've got to get busy, get prepared, mate. Right? And so with Napishtim, he's like, all right, I'm gonna build a huge ship and I'm gonna fill it up with everyone I love, a bunch of useful stuff, and also some animals and grains. And of course, this story transformed into Noah, etc. But and Leal, you know, he finds out that Utnapishtim has been warned by Ea, and he's like, somebody's gonna pay for this, right? But before he can do something, and Leal's son, Ninurta, calms him down. He's like, listen, before you go and, you know, start beating up Utnapishtim, right? Before you do that, you should consider the fact that we can just starve people to death, right? We can also throw in some dangerous animals here and there, right? But we've got famine and dangerous animals, and we can just cure overpopulation with that, right? You don't need to worry about noise anymore. You don't even need to worry about doing anything. Just starve people to death and kill them with tigers. And, you know, everybody's happy, right? So when Leal's like, yeah, forget it. We can do it in a more humane way, right? Out of the love of humanity, we shall let you all starve and get eaten alive instead of flooding you all, right? So that's the kind of love of humanity that we find in the ancient world, right? And the Epic of Gilgamesh is a variation of an even older story, which we only have fragments of. So we're not sure if the flood is being caused by a god trying to kill everybody, but I'm pretty sure it is, right? If you look at other cultures around the world, there's some similarities. Sometimes it's a little bit gentler. The tone is gentler. So for example, there's a Navajo story where Coyote, who plays a big part in North American Indian mythology, he says, if we all live and continue to increase as we did in the past, the earth will be too small to hold us. And there will be no room for the cornfields. You gotta have corn, okay? And it's better that each of us should live but a limited time on this earth than leave and make room for the children, right? And there's a mythological story from the Bhuya people of India. Not Bhuya like Bhuya, but Bhuiya, Bhuya people. And they believed that in the beginning, people were immortal, which started to become a problem. And then the guy in charge, you know, in their cosmology, his name's Mahaprabhu, he began to wonder, where is there going to be room for all these people? Right? And interestingly enough, it's kind of like accurate scientifically because bacteria, like our distant ancestors, were immortal and are immortal still because they didn't branch off into mammal bodies like we did, but they were immortal, and eventually different solutions started with sexual reproduction, which introduced death. Obviously, they didn't know that back then, but you've got the Vogel. It's an indigenous Russian culture. And they said that after marriage was introduced to the planet, people began to procreate to the point where food was desperately scarce and the world was plunged into poverty. And as a solution, they had this sky god. His name's Numitarem. And Numitarem said, well, I don't want to get my hands dirty. And so he got his buddy, his name Zulater. It's like Xul apostrophe ater, Ater. And I like how it's kind of sounds like a Klingon or something, like Zulater. And he's got an appropriately scary name, the demon of disease and death, right? And as you could imagine, the demon of disease and death went around spreading sickness on the planet and killing people, right? To clear things up a bit. So as you can see, it's not an uncommon sentiment, right? That, it's like, there's too much people, too much peopling here, right? Just clear things up using death, right? So it's not exactly a fear of death, at least when it's happening to other people. And of course, Bill Burr has the best, funniest expression of this view, right? Where he's got this bit about, about how 85% of the people on the planet they gotta go, right? They gotta get out of here. And this is an idea that I think a lot of people hold privately and not so privately. I mean, I've seen a video that Abby Martin uploaded where she goes around asking people in Israel, like, I think what to do about Palestine. And some of them are just like, yeah, we'll just like bomb them all, just kill them all, right? And they just say it so like casually, kind of. I mean, they're obviously angry and stuff, but for me to say, like, it's just strange to me to be so yeah, just kill a bunch of people, right? Because I think it's hard to really like to pair the emotions of like a genocide with the expression of it, right? Because like, I don't know, like even if you see like a cute puppy getting like beaten up, right? I saw this video on Reddit of this guy kind of like abusing this dog, and then this bull comes and like attacks the guy and saves the dog, and I'm just like, yeah, justice, right? So even just like a little bit of like harming a dog, people respond to, let alone like a human being, right? And then you imagine that, like multiplied by hundreds or thousands. It's just like the emotion would just like explode your brain. It's like so much suffering. But I think when people talk about like genocide casually like that, it's not so much that, they are like some horrible demon from hell. It's just that like emotions of like frustration and disgust with one person or a couple of people or a few people or an idea of people, it gets so intense that it's just like, just like kill them all, right? Or just like kill them like cockroaches. And like the genocides in Rwanda, I think they specifically described their victims as cockroaches, right? To dehumanize them. But anyway, so that's one of the reasons that Nietzsche is frustrated with the saccharine mask of the love of humanity, right? But obviously not everyone can express Nietzsche's idea gracefully, right? Or not everyone can be as funny as Bill Burr when talking about, wanting to kill most people on the planet or just to get rid of them. And, there's this one day when I was waiting in line and I struck up a conversation with the guy in front of me, a guy named Jacob. And we started talking about overpopulation somehow, maybe because it was a really busy and crowded area. It was a small building. And he made this striking remark. He's like, there's too many people on the planet. And he phrased it in such a way that I immediately recognized it as being plagiarized from Bill Burr. So I'm like, hey, like, are you into Bill Burr? He's like, yeah, man, that dude's awesome. I'm like, yes. I wonder where your ideas come from. But so in contrast to Bill Burr, Jacob and his contempt for the abundance of people didn't really have like much of that self-deprecating humor that tends to smooth out the rough edges in Bill Burr's act. Didn't have the, Nietzsche's ability to, inhabit a multiplicity of mutually exclusive perspectives. And I think that's fair because, Nietzsche is, one of the greatest philosophers ever, and Bill Burr is one of the greatest comedians ever. So, you can't really have these standards for a regular Joe and or a regular Jacob for that matter, because Jacob's day job was, something working with sheet metal. It sounded really grueling when I asked him about it. And he had these cuts on his fingers to prove it. And, we were in line to buy weed, and he explained that he used it to just like obliterate his consciousness after coming home from work, which dissolved any romantic image I had of fellow weed smokers as people who, use it as a way to explore spirituality and creativity. It's just like, I need to stop feeling pain and, yeah, dulling, negative affect, as they call it. So I don't think it's rare to be like that. I don't think people like Jacob are rare at all. TBQH. I think it's common for people who suffer from a painful job to use chemicals to like numb themselves, anesthetize their souls, so to speak, or maybe they'll use uppers to kind of just like smash some energy into their body. I also want to bring up the Mahabharata, because I think there's an interesting little twist they have. So in the Mahabharata, it's a really famous old Indian story. So famous that I need to tell you it's famous, in fact. And in it, we see the overcrowded earth talking to the god Brahma. So in this case, the earth actually has a voice. And the earth is saying there's too many people, right? But then Brahma, he's like, all right, listen, I get where you're coming from. There is quite a few, right? But he can't figure out how to do it, right? So again, like in other stories, he gets someone else to do the dirty work. So, sorry, I messed it up. There is someone else doing the dirty work, but hold on. So Brahma can't figure out how to get rid of the people efficiently, right? And he actually gets so angry at this fact that he decides to kill them all, right? Lots of love of humanity here. And Shiva decides to step in and save humanity, and they make a compromise, right? It's like, well, we're not going to save everybody. We're not going to kill everybody. So this is kind of like the Russian story where they're like, okay, let's send the goddess of death to Earth, right? So death does their business. But the interesting twist here is that death actually hates this job of killing people, right? Death is like, I just see people, like screaming for their lives all day. It's not really, I'm finding it tough to get a work-life balance here, right? Having my emotions kind of shattered day in, day out. And so Brahma is like, okay, I'm going to give you assistance such as disease, hatred, greed, violence, jealousy, envy, so on, right? And Brahma figures, okay, well, if you have all these friends helping you out or assistants helping you out, then people are going to be like, well, death is actually kind of great, right? We finally get some relief from all these awful assistants, right? From all this greed and jealousy and envy, right? And I like this because it's interesting to me how the misery of life can actually cultivate this strong hatred that makes people's love of death really blossom. I mean, they might not necessarily become suicidal, although of course they might. They might become really self-destructive in ways that they might, not really notice, or they'll just find ways to relish in the suffering of others and the death of others, or find fascination with it, right? And a really incredible example of this is from the 6th century BC. the Neo-Babylonian period, which was a very economically prosperous time. But as with all prosperity and progress and happy sunshine rainbows, there's some dirty business in the background. And in this case, there was this woman who was kind of at the end of her rope, right? And she really acts out. And we have this record from temple officials from Uruk, right? And so it begins with this really like pompous, awkward, like official language. They're like, on the 22nd of the month of Vayaru of the first year of Cambyses, king of Babylon, king of all the lands, right? So that would be like, me saying, me like putting a little report at work, being like, on the 1st of January 2022, in the land of Trudeau, he who made weed legal, the greatest of all men, that kind of thing. Anyway, so king of Babylon, we're in the first year of Cambyses, king of Babylon, and we've got this woman, Misatu. So Misatu, a female serf of Ishtar of Uruk, took a lump of clay in our presence and beat a dog with it. We asked her, why are you beating the dog? And she replied, I would like to die together with it. The dog she beat died of the beating. Right, so they had this tremendous economic growth at the cost of treating a large class of people like expendable economic instruments, right? And the reason that they even recorded this is because it was subversive to, kill yourself, right? Because they needed the labor, right? They couldn't just have people, wiping themselves out, or else no one's going to be able to do this dirty work. And from what I remember, she was doing some kind of, textile manufacturing, which had all sorts of dyes and awful chemicals or something. I don't know. Wasn't a good time. But so there was plenty to go around, but not everybody was getting some. And a lot of people lived lives of painful drudgery with lots of rage and hatred in their hearts. And I think there's a lot of, correct me if I'm wrong, I think maybe some people, a tiny bit of people today don't fully, completely love their job. There's not a lot of love to go around. Anyway, what does this mean in scientific terms? Like, is overpopulation a real issue for resources? And if you look at demographers at conservative think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute, they suggest that overpopulation isn't an issue, right? The problem is poverty. And the scientific journal Nature, they ran an article on myths, and they said that overpopulation, the idea of overpopulation, well, it's a commonly misunderstood thing, and there's more than enough resources for everybody, but there's a negligence when it comes to the distribution of goods. And so now you might say like, oh, well, that's fine. Let's just find a way to distribute goods properly. And I actually think that this is worse news than overpopulation, right? This idea that distribution is falling short, because like, if this was an issue for thousands of years, right, then I don't know if we're going to be able to like change it anytime soon, right? Because when it comes to ingrained behaviors like greed and domination and jealousy and aggression, like what was the assistance that Brahma gave death? Well, yeah, disease, hatred, greed, violence, jealousy, envy. Those things have been around for a long time, right? And so like, are we gonna rejoice that we only have to, alter these extremely deeply ingrained behaviors rather than just, having some incentives where people, stop reproducing? I mean, it's actually pretty common now for people to forego child rearing because it's such a hassle economically. I mean, for many reasons, but it seems like easier to just be like, oh, just stop. Ugh, just we don't need any more people. I mean, there's this one story I've heard about how I think in Brazil, somewhere in South America, they introduced cable TV and people started having fewer kids because I guess the idea is that they were just having sex and making babies because they were bored. They had nothing better to do. So, I mean, it seems like there's easier ways to curb overpopulation or to curb the creation of new people rather than, just being like, hey, just be kind and love everybody, right? Which doesn't seem to be super effective. But anyway, one of the ways in which I think Nietzsche is so helpful here is that he advocates for like maximum flexibility of perspective. There's another part in the same section that I quoted from in the beginning where he says, "We are delighted with all who love as we do danger, war, adventure, who refuse to compromise, to be captured, reconciled, and castrated. We count ourselves among conquerors. We think about the necessity for new orders, also for a new slavery, for every strengthening and enhancement of the human type also involves a new kind of enslavement. Is it not clear that with all this we are bound to feel ill at ease in an age that likes to claim the distinction of being the most humane, the mildest, and the most righteous age that the sun has ever seen?" Right? So I find it interesting how, there's this idea of Brahma giving death assistance, right? That make people love death, so to speak. Then Nietzsche's like, wait a minute, like, those things are actually badass and I love them, right? I love danger. I love war. I love adventure, right? I love this dynamic mess of humanity, right? I love jealousy and envy and competition and struggle. He's just like, come on, bro, right? He's ready for it all, right? It's this kind of like, this strength. He's kind of like an MMA fighter. He's like, jealousy, envy, I'm ready for it, right? He wants to incorporate all that into life, to enrich it, right? Not to just be like, everything but love, everything, right? So it's like just get rid of anything except just love, right? There's something kind of yucky about that in a perspective. So, when I read about being captured and reconciled and castrated, I think a couple of things. I think a school, right? It was just like, just fit into this box and, and homework. Oh my God. But I also think of dogs, right? I find it to be quite a nightmare to think that human beings have physically bred out their ability to resist and fight back, to be strong and independent. They smile at being in chains, on leashes, and they smile at their masters, their captors. I mean, like anybody else, I appreciate and love and enjoy cute dog videos. I use them, to cheer myself up. Right, just like this little creature that's just like so forgiving and will always kind of be by your side. I definitely recommend Norm Macdonald's comedy album, Hitler's Dog. I think that's what it's called. He has this amazing bit about Hitler's dog. But yes, but they were kind of, there's these mutants created to fire off the neurons that makes us, swoon at their adorable little faces. But I would say that more often than not, I see lots of abuse, right? And I'm not even going to count necessarily the stuff that I consider abuse, but in kind of like a way that might be hard to convince others of, where it's like, people putting dogs into strollers. I don't know, but anyway, if we look at just like regular garden variety abuse, right? I see dogs getting like hit and smacked and choked and dragged and yanked, right? just people just like on their phone, just like, come on, right? Um, Not to say that people don't treat their dogs well, but from what I'm seeing, right? And I can't, what am I going to do, right? The dog is basically their property, right? It's not like with other children and other human beings where like there's kind of this idea that they belong to humanity as a whole, right? So you can't just, destroy your own child because like, oh, well, it's my kid, right? But with dogs, like people do kill them, right? If they get inconvenient or they just abandon them. I don't know what the laws are on that, but it's all kind of a crazy mess. But you know, I can't really say that I'm like in some moral superior area where like I would never condone any sort of violence against anyone. I mean, there's this story that Schopenhauer relates where there's a dog that mauls its owner in retaliation of abuse, right? And I mean, it's kind of satisfying. I know it's kind of gross to admit, but like Schopenhauer, he says, I think with satisfaction of a case reported some years ago in the Times where Lord X kept a large dog on a chain. One day, as he was walking through the yard, he took it into his head to go and pat the dog, whereupon the animal tore his arm open from top to bottom, and quite right, too. What he meant by this was, you are not my master, but my devil who makes a hell of my brief existence. May this happen to all who chain up dogs. Now, I don't know if I necessarily agree with Schopenhauer's characterization of the dog's mind state. I don't really know if he thinks like, you're not my master, dude. You're a devil who makes a hell of my existence, like of my brief existence. I don't think they have that ability. And I mean, there's this one story of a woman who got her face ripped apart, like totally disfigured by a chimpanzee. But the thing is, the reason that chimp went crazy is because this other woman was keeping the chimp in a cage, day in, day out. And the chimp was just like, you know, like morbidly obese and just like, stuck in this cage and just like rage, like filling his mind, like, oh, like day in, day out, just like rage and hatred. And the woman got her neighbor to take care of it or something like that. And then the neighbor opened the cage and the chimp just like, rah, just like attacked, right? And, I was thinking like, chimps probably are smart enough to think of people as of like to recognize who's in charge maybe. But, when it comes to just like suffering and anger, it's just like they want to attack something or someone. Cause I mean, like my dad got attacked by a dog and he was just like playing with the dog. But sometimes dogs, like they're just, if they feel fear or just like they just feel something of like, oh, this is bad, like attack, right? Depending on their breed, they might just have that like in them. They have like a higher threshold for reactive aggression. They can't really tamper it down. And really like reactive aggression was specifically bred out of dogs with wolves, right? Because you don't want the dog to be reactively aggressive. You just want them to be obedient, right? And I kind of like how Schopenhauer here, he's like, you know what? I'm glad that creatures have this ability to fight back and be strong and independent, right? It somehow doesn't really have the usual Schopenhauerian flavor of this kind of like resignation and seeing things from like a distance, right? I feel like he's got some of that Nietzschean vitality in him when he talks about this. But yeah, so like the ability to incorporate the delight of danger and war and adventure, that means like we have a whole new vista of appreciation for life, right? Which Nietzsche calls humaneness. So I want to read, to end this off here, a section from the Gay Science that talks about this, right? Section 337. And so he begins, anyone who manages to experience the history of humanity as a whole, as his own history, will feel in an enormously generalized way all the grief of an invalid who thinks of health, of an old man who thinks of the dreams of his youth, of a lover deprived of his beloved, of the martyr whose ideal is perishing, of the hero on the evening after a battle that has decided nothing but brought him wounds and the loss of his friend. So basically, it's not going to be easy and fun to do this, what he's suggesting here, right? To continue, he says, but if one endured, if you could endure this, right? If you can, just get through if you can really stomach the history of humanity, of mankind. If you can do that, if one could endure this immense sum of grief of all kinds, while yet being the hero who, as the second day of battle breaks, welcomes the dawn and his fortune, being a person whose horizon encompasses thousands of years past and future, being the heir of all the nobility of all past spirit, an heir with a sense of obligation, the most aristocratic of old nobles, and at the same time the first of a new nobility, the like of which no age has yet seen or dreamed of. If one could burden one's soul with all of this, the oldest, the newest losses, hopes, conquests, and the victories of humanity, if one could finally contain all this in one soul and crowd it into a single feeling, this would surely have to result in a happiness that humanity has not known so far. The happiness of a God full of power and love, full of tears and laughter, a happiness that, like the sun in the evening, continually bestows its inexhaustible riches, pouring them into the sea, feeling richest as the sun does, only when even the poorest fisherman is still rowing with golden oars. Oof. This godlike feeling would then be called humaneness. So, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I read this, I just get like chills throughout my body. It's just like he has such a great understanding of like the weight of misery that we're faced with, being human. He's very well aware of that, and he phrases it so perfectly. And then he sees hope, right? This strange hope of incorporating all that. He talks about the poorest fisherman rowing with golden oars. Like, that is so loving, right? And I think it's common to think of Nietzsche as kind of like this tough, like, "Ugh, don't look at me," right? He even has this giant mustache. Can't even really see and read his lips. So if you find a poor fisherman, give him a golden oar. Tell him Nietzsche sent you.